Started here. This will be recorded just so everyone is aware as we um, save these workshops to put on our OCHN YouTube page. That way others who might not have been able to attend tonight can still come back and see this information. Or if there's something that you maybe want to re-listen to, you'll have that available. So welcome to February's SUD Community Workshop, Cannabis and Psychotropic Medications. We're so excited to have you here with us tonight. Again, I'm going to apologize for my voice. I lost it. Hopefully it comes back soon. So I'm going to keep it short and sweet. I am Anna Jessup. I am one of the SUD clinical analysts here at OCHN and help coordinate all the community workshops that we have here. And we keep growing them each year. So we're excited to have you here and excited to have Emily here, who will be our presenter today. She's one of the nurse practitioners at Oakland Family Services. So we're so fortunate that she's able to present this very interesting and most definitely requested topic. Before we quickly get started here, just a couple of housekeeping items. Again, please make sure that you do have your mute on. That way we don't have the background noise, and also that way there might be some things you might not want us to hear that we could hear. We do encourage you to have your cameras on so we can see who is here with us tonight. It is not required though, but with having 67 people in this room, it would definitely be beautiful to see a lot of your faces here tonight. We're so excited to have that many people here with us. This workshop is eligible for 1.5 specific McBAP CEUs. All you have to do is attend this full session and then complete the evaluation at the end, which we'll provide the link for as the workshop does wrap up. Please make sure on when you do complete the evaluation that you use the email at the end that you want the certificate to be sent to, as that is the email that we will utilize. So please make sure that is done, and we'll send that reminder as well at the end. This workshop goes until about 8 o'clock. We'll wrap up a little bit before then to make sure there's time for questions and things of that nature. Any technical assistance needed with the evaluation. In this PowerPoint, there are specific places that we do have questions. As we know, this topic is probably going to bring on questions and conversation and things of that nature. Please use the chat feature for questions and comments until we get to those specific breakout sessions, or not breakout sessions, sorry, but times that we set aside for questions. Kaylee, who is my counterpart here from OCHN on our outreach and communications team, she is going to help me monitor the chat while Emily presents. And in the meantime, also use the raise a hand feature. So with all that being said, I'm going to mute myself and rest my voice and turn it over to Emily. Emily, welcome. We're so excited to have you here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you very much. And hi, everybody. So I am Emily Stefanic, and tonight we're going to talk a little bit about cannabis and about psychotropic medications. So I just want to tell you a little bit about myself. I really appreciate everybody having that chat box open and telling me where you're coming from. But a little bit about myself. So I am licensed in the state of Michigan, actually as a licensed professional counselor and as a physician assistant. I have education as well in marriage and family therapy. And I've worked in mental health and substance abuse treatment for almost 20 years, working with children, adults, adolescents, in outpatient and inpatient settings, and with a variety of referral sources. So CMH, insurance, primary care physicians, courts, licensing boards, all kinds of things. And right now I am working with Oakland Family Services. I have been on and off for a very long time. So I am working there in their children's CMH program, which is specialized services for youth, and then again in our regular behavioral health outpatient program and substance use outpatient program, which is called Day One. So it's nice to see some of you guys here too. So today we are going to talk about a few different things. So our goals are going to be primarily to just briefly explore some basics about cannabis and cannabinoids. We're going to learn about how cannabis use can impact development and through our childhood and adolescence. And then we're going to explore some mechanisms and realities about drug-drug interactions, hi Jen, between cannabinoids and psychotropic medications. And so before we get started, before we jump in, I really do want to take the opportunity to just kind of set the tone for tonight. This is a little bit of a hot button topic, and lots of people have lots of opinions, right? So the main thing is we're not here tonight to focus on merits or dangers of cannabis or marijuana, right? We're just here to become a little bit more informed and to do that without judgment about whether using is a good thing or a bad thing. We're just going to learn a little bit more about what it looks like in mental health, in development, and when we're prescribed medications. And just like Anna said, feel free to enter any questions into the chat. We'll have a little blip of time in the middle, and then again at the end, where we'll be able to talk more in depth about any questions that do come up while we are talking. So let's start, and we'll just start talking a little bit about cannabis. So cannabis plant contains over 540 different chemical compounds, including more than 144 known cannabinoids. What's really interesting is the first time that I gave the presentation that I built this one off of was about 4 or 5 years ago, and those numbers already had to be updated. So we are learning more and more about what cannabinoids are in cannabis, what they do, how they interact with our own endocannabinoid system, which we'll talk about. So in just a few short years, we've already had to update those numbers pretty significantly. The most well-known cannabinoids, everyone's heard of them, right? We have THC and CBD, and then there's other compounds in cannabis, including terpenes, flavonoids, and alkaloids. We're not going to talk a whole lot in depth about specific details about THC and CBD, so I do want to just take a couple minutes and touch on those. I often talk to my patients and educate my patients on the difference because, as you'll see in the next slide, THC is something that is much more present in a much higher ratio in marijuana that's available today than it has been in the past. And when we think about THC, that's our most psychoactive component, right? So THC is going to be more psychoactive. It's actually a pro-psychotic, so it can contribute to psychosis type symptoms, hallucinations, paranoia, delusions. It's what we call anxiogenic. So over time, think anxio-anxiety, genic, generating or building. THC over time will build that anxiety. So people often think, oh, I'm going to use some marijuana to release my anxiety. And a main component is doing the opposite of that. CBD, on the other hand, is anxiolytic. So anxio-anxiety, lytic, lysis breaking. So it helps to reduce anxiety. CBD is also really a little bit better for muscle pain, inflammatory pain compared to nerve pain with THC. And it's actually has some antipsychotic properties. So there's some super interesting research that's been done on whether or not it can be used as an antipsychotic. Not great outcomes, but still very cool, very exciting. So it does have some of those properties. So that's just a little blip into both THC and CBD. Cannabinoids and their metabolites exert their effects on our own endocannabinoid system. And in general, you'll hear me say a lot, like things that we don't know, things that we do know, things that we're learning. In general, research has been really limited with cannabis, marijuana in medical contexts and learning about how it impacts us because it's a Schedule I substance federally. So if we want to think about cannabis over time, cannabis has been around for a really long time, right? Humans have interacted with this plant in a variety of ways for thousands and thousands of years. We've used it for food sources, we've used it medicinally, we've used it for recreational purposes, we've used it to have fibers to make fabrics and clothing and ropes, right? So we have a very long history with this plant. It is, like I said, a Schedule I drug federally, which means when you think about the FDA schedules, A Schedule 1 in essence means that there is no accepted positive benefit of using this substance. So it makes it a very difficult substance for us to research. If you think about ethics board and what we can do ethically and can't do in research, we can't give somebody something if there's no accepted use that would be a positive, a benefit, something that we would be looking for, if it's only seen as having a potential to harm, right? It is now legal for medical and recreational use in several states. It's legal for medical use in 39 states right now, and for recreational use in 24 states. And that has changed the landscape a little bit. So as it's become legal in the states, it has, even though it's remained as Schedule 1 federally, it has become something that we can now do a little bit more research on, and a little bit more research that's more hands-on, not just observational studies, right? We all probably, many people in this room have probably used marijuana, know somebody who uses marijuana, has been in the same room as marijuana, right? It is prolific. It is all over the place. And we definitely have people that we are working with, that we are serving, that are also using marijuana in some capacity. It's estimated that about 1 in 5 Americans use marijuana in some capacity. And I think it was about like 20 or 22% people worldwide. One of the things that is really important when you think about that number is how much not just our understanding of marijuana has changed, but also marijuana itself has changed. So the marijuana that's available today is exceptionally different than it was even 10 or 20 years ago. So in the 1970s, right? So if you think about, the 60s and the 70s and people in colleges or young adults using marijuana, the THC concentration in that marijuana was approximately 2%. In 1996, so we're coming up on about 30 years later, the average THC concentration in available marijuana was about 5%. So an increase, not a very significant one. Today, the average THC concentration is anywhere from 20 to 35% in most marijuana that's available. And then we also have those concentrated forms. You might hear things like wax, hash oil, rosin. Those concentrated forms, people are usually using significantly less, but that THC content can be up to 90%. It's usually somewhere between 60 and 90% THC content, which is remarkably high. So, and totally different from your mom and dad's marijuana in college. The other thing that has changed over time is now we use cannabis as medical treatments. So as of 2022, and I did look, and as far as I can tell, as of today, the US FDA has approved 3 cannabinoid-based pharmaceuticals. These are all synthetic cannabinoid-based pharmaceuticals, so they're not pulled from naturally from the plant, but they are made in a lab, cannabinoids. So, and I am going to slaughter these names. I do apologize. So we have in the US dronabinol and nabilone. Those are for treatment of anorexia and HIV and for nausea and vomiting resulting from chemotherapy. And one thing to keep in mind, in our behavioral health world, anorexia has one word. In the medical world, it has anorexia has one meaning, not word. In the medical world, it has a very different meaning. It just means can't eat, right? No appetite, not eating. There's also Epidiolex, which is based more structurally similar to CBD, and it's approved to treat 2 very specific forms of severe pediatric epilepsy. that cause intractable seizures. So seizures that are very, very hard to maintain control over with any other kind of medication. There is also outside of the United States, nabiximols. That's approved for neuropathic pain and spasticity and multiple sclerosis. And that is more of a synthetic THC component that is used for that medication. So cannabinoids exert their effects on our endocannabinoid system. So we're going to do a lot of endogenous and exogenous talking tonight. Anything endo or endogenous, that means it's already within us. It's something that comes from our body makes it, it's in our body, right? Exogenous is anything outside that we're introducing into that environment. So our endogenous endocannabinoid system is a system of receptors, enzymes, and neurotransmitters within our body. There's two main receptor types that are part and parcel of our endocannabinoid system. We have CB1 and CB2. CB1 is primarily found in our neural tissue, so in different structures in our brain and throughout our central nervous system. And CB2 is primarily found in tissue that's related to our immune system. Together, our endocannabinoid system regulates a lot of things. So we'll go through the list, but think about what all of these things do around your body, right? So cognition, memory, coordination, our reward system, heart rate, stress response, appetite, immune function, intraocular pressure, so the pressure inside of your eyes, emetic reflex. Emetic is like our vomiting reflex, GI motility, and reproductive health, specifically female reproductive health. It is also, what we'll be talking a little bit more about, is highly implicated in neurodevelopment. So the development of your central nervous system. Our endocannabinoid system plays a very big role in that. If you think about all of those things, right, that means that it's also implicated in some of the problematic potential things that can happen related to heavy cannabis use. So when we have very heavy cannabis use multiple times throughout the day, especially high THC content, most days or every day, we can have some really serious potential side effects of that or syndromes because of that. So we have cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, which is a cyclical vomiting syndrome. So I vomit uncontrollably in bursts, and it's very hard to get control of. I often have to go to the emergency room because I can't keep anything in, so I need fluids so I'm not getting dehydrated. This is really, really tough to treat. A lot of people don't believe it exists or don't know about it. And so when they're going to the emergency room because they're having a very hard time not vomiting, it's difficult to have that conversation of this may be because you're smoking marijuana, if we're able to figure out that they're smoking marijuana, right? And the treatment is also very difficult because one of the things that we have to do in cannabis hyperemesis is go for a very extended time without using marijuana. And that's often a difficult thing to get people who are using that heavily to do voluntarily. Cannabis-induced psychosis is also possible. Often people will say to me, well, it's probably not just from the cannabis, it's probably that it was laced with something, which can absolutely happen. We can also have psychosis that is induced purely from cannabis. THC is a pro-psychotic, right? We can have psychotic symptoms because of that. Again, this can be a really tricky one to treat. Practically, it's not that hard. I've seen it a few times. I've treated it successfully a few times. If we need medication treatment, it's not a very long course of an antipsychotic. The problem is we need a very long period of not using marijuana, possibly ongoing, because those symptoms can return. We also see with cannabis use increased risk for heart attack and stroke. So we know that it has an impact on our cardiovascular system and our stress response. So we do have an increased risk for heart attack and stroke with heavy cannabis use. And so all of those potentially negative consequences, you can see how they're related to those areas where our endocannabinoid system is working in our body. Now we want to talk about cannabis in development. So before we talk about what it's like when we're not having very normal development, we need to talk about what normal development looks like in terms of our endocannabinoid system. So in normal development, we have CB1 receptors throughout our neural tissue. And from childhood through adolescence, they increase in number. And by the time we get to adolescence, we have a maximum density of CB1 receptors in our neural tissue. Around the age where our neurological development really kind of hits a wall and starts to slow down, that's when we see the density of those CB1 receptors dropping as well. So there is a very significant role in our pruning and our development of our central nervous system that those CB1 receptors are playing. What pruning means, so we have our neurons, right? And they have the little tail and the little branches, and they're sending out little branches everywhere, and they want to make different connections. And we want to make in development a whole bunch of connections. And the connections that we use the most are going to be reinforced. And the connections that we don't use that much are just going to kind of go away. So we're pruning those. We're sending out a bunch of branches, and we're keeping what sticks, and everything else is not going to stick around for us as we get into adulthood. And this still happens when we're adults, right? We still have plasticity. We're still building new connections, but it's not happening at the rate and the capacity that it happens in that development until our early to mid 20s. So with that being such a critical time for neuronal pruning, we know that our endogenous cannabinoid system is playing a really significant role in that process of sending out those branches and making those connections that we want to keep moving forward. So what happens when we bring exogenous cannabinoids in? Remember, exogenous means from the outside, bringing them in. So we have a lot of studies that show that THC use, especially heavy and frequent use, causes reduced dendritic branching. So all of those little branches that are going out, we're sending out fewer of them, which means that we have fewer opportunity to make the kind of connections that are going to stick around. And when we don't have as many of those connections, we actually see reduction in cortical thinning. So heavy exogenous THC use, heavy outside coming in THC use specifically, can result in cortical thinning when it's happening throughout that really important developmental period. So when we have thinning in the prefrontal cortex, we know our prefrontal cortex is responsible for executive functioning. Things like planning, decision-making, working memory, regulating our emotions, solving problems, paying attention, all of that kind of stuff, right? So now we don't have as many connections that are learning how to do that. We're going to have some impact in those areas. We're not going to do those things as well because we don't have as many of those branches going out to make those connections for us to do those things well in our adolescence. It also that cortical thinning can also lead to greater vulnerability for some psychiatric illnesses. So that was primarily about THC. And one of the things that a lot of families will ask me, families with young kids, is, well, okay, so THC, I can't give that to my child, but what about CBD, right? It works really great for me for my anxiety, and I want to give it to them. And so here's basically what I tell them, right? Most of our research on those impacts is done on THC. There is some that's been done on CBD. It does show a correlation between CBD use in adolescence and impaired executive functioning. There's not a large body of that research right now. However, we know the role of that endocannabinoid system in our development. We know that any exogenous cannabinoid is going to have an impact on that system. And so it's more likely than not that there could be an impact on that neuronal development by introducing exogenous cannabinoids during that time period. So it's not something that I ever recommend or suggest, simply because we don't necessarily know that it is safe in adolescents. CBD is generally considered pretty safe in adults, but we don't have that density of those CB1 receptors. We don't have our endocannabinoid system working so hard to develop the connections that are going to be the basis for our central nervous system. So that is something that any of those exogenous cannabinoids really are not recommended in childhood or adolescence, because we don't know what kind of impact that's going to have long term on that development. So basically, same kind of thing, right? Cannabis impacts on development are dependent upon several factors. And this is something that is really important, right? Frequency of use, amount of use, what is it that you're using, and some genetic factors are all going to play a role in this. It's going to be very, very different if a 14-year-old kiddo tells me I hit a joint once at a party than a 14-year-old kiddo who comes in and tells me, yeah, I'm smoking marijuana every day before school and when I get home and before bed, right? The impacts on development in those two people are going to be very, very different. The greater amount you're bringing in, the greater impact it's going to have on that system. And still, there is no amount of cannabis use in children or adolescents that is known to be safe at this point. I do want to just take a couple minutes to touch on some other interesting research about marijuana before we move on to kind of the next section. In general, marijuana has a great PR firm, if you will, right? It's really a substance that has a very strong positive perception in our society in general. There's a really strong focus on those positive perceptions and a lot of resistance to anything that might push against those. There's wide assumptions that marijuana is a cure-all in cases of various ailments and doesn't have any negative consequences. And I think the thing that's really important to keep in mind there is that's not true of anything. It's not true of alcohol. It's not true of sugar or fat. It's not true of vitamins or minerals. It's not true of water, right? We can absolutely take in too much water and make ourselves very, very unwell. We can take in too much of anything, right? So any substance has the possibility to have positives and negatives. So I do just want to touch on some of the other interesting research, like I said, before we move on. The first one is one of my favorite studies. I think it's fascinating. It kind of addresses the ethical issue we've had with being able to do a double blind where we're giving marijuana and giving a treatment, or giving marijuana and giving a placebo, right? So it's a long-term Dutch observational study, 1992 to 2011. So it is a long-term observational study with more than 2,200 participants. And what they did is they studied symptoms of PTSD, and they monitored that for THC use. They adjusted for baseline symptoms and did what they could, nothing is perfect, but to adjust for other factors. But they compared never users, people who used but stopped, people who didn't use and started, and people who used the whole time. And it showed that with THC use, there was a longer-term worsening of severity of symptoms of PTSD, especially anxiety, panic, and insomnia. That's that anxiogenic piece, right? It doesn't necessarily happen right away. It can happen over a period of use. At least one study demonstrated a statistically significant increase in suicidal ideation and attempts in adolescents using cannabis. We have multiple studies you've probably seen there. I think one came out within the last year or so. There seemed to be an awful lot of headlines about it, but that demonstrate a predicted risk for psychosis in adolescents who consistently use marijuana. And then another long-term observational study demonstrated a correlation between persistent marijuana use with neuropsychological decline across domains of functioning, including a reduction in full-scale IQ. And that wasn't just about developmental. So there is some really interesting stuff. There's also some studies that show some positive impacts. Like I said, there's some really cool research being done into CBD as an antipsychotic treatment. There's a lot of new stuff coming out. And the important thing, if you're going to look into any of that research, if you're going to try and expose yourself to it and understand any of it, is to read a lot of it and to think about some of those things that we all learned in our favorite classes, like research methods and statistics, to see, is this a well-designed study, right? Something that tracks 4 people, probably not very generalizable, probably not very well designed. So when we're looking at that research, we want to see some of those things. Where's the funding coming from? Is it well designed? What did they find? What did they recognize might have been an issue? And so on. Okay, so right now I do want to take a little pause and see if there are any questions.
We do have one in the chat. They said,
Okay.
question is referencing the increase in THC concentrations throughout the years. What is the reason behind this?
I would guess it has something to do with how plants are being cultivated differently. There's also a lot of research into, you've probably heard about some of the different plants, right? Sativa, indica, there's an idea in the world that these do different things for different people. And genetically at this point, there really isn't much of a separation between those two plants. There really isn't genetically a significant difference between sativa and indica anymore. So I think as we're cultivating plants differently, we're mass cultivating plants, we're cultivating plants in homes and in situations that are not what we were doing in the 70s, right? I think that has really had an impact on that THC content. And then I see there's another one. So The question is, edibles with high CBD to THC ratio both increase the effectiveness of CBD and decreases psychoactive properties of THC. Is there any truth to this? Maybe. Probably not to the extent that it's being pushed in that way. When I am, and I'm probably going to touch on it a little bit later, but when I am talking to my patients about their marijuana use, one of the things that I'll often start that conversation with, we'll do a little bit of education stuff, but one of the main things is, where are you at? What do you want? And then the idea that we're all sold is that this makes us feel better. But what I hear from a lot of my patients, especially patients with bipolar disorder, especially patients with any psychosis, especially patients with very high anxiety, is that if they stop and pay attention to how they feel when they use, they don't feel better. We're really told this is going to help you with this. And in Joe walking down the street who feels anxious sometimes when he has to do a presentation at work, it might help him with that. But when we have some of these other things going on, it often is less helpful than we're sold. So I talk to people about looking, now that we can go to a dispensary and we know what kind of ratio we're getting. In theory, it's not the best regulated, but it's there. Someone can tell us what they believe is in there. Look for things with a higher CBD ratio. If I'm used to using something with 30% THC and I get that down to 10 or 5% and the rest of it CBD, I probably am going to feel less of the psychoactive properties of THC. Is it necessarily because of the CBD, or is it just because that ratio is different now and the CBD is the one that's more prevalent in that product? I don't think that we can really say yet. Were there any other questions before we move on? And remember, there will be another section at the end too. Okay. All right. So what now? One thing we know, 1 in 5 people in America are using marijuana, right? In some capacity, in some form. So it's inevitable that many of our teens and adults receiving treatment for mental illness are also using marijuana. Especially because, like we just talked about, there's kind of this message that this will help with your anxiety or this will help with your mood. So it's often something before they even get to us that they have been using to try to help manage some of their symptoms. When we have mental illness, we also have increased vulnerability to some of the negative impacts that cannabis can have on mental health. That sentence is terrible. That's the one I meant to fix. Sorry about all the extra words. So what do we know? We know that the main method of cannabinoid metabolism is through hepatic mechanisms. So hepatic, our liver, right? So it's going and being metabolized in our liver in the same way that a lot of our psychotropic medications are being metabolized, which can lead to potentially impactful drug-to-drug interactions. This is the part where I start to lose you. So as your eyes glaze over, one, take a look at this beautiful path and imagine you're there instead of here where it's snowy and cold and listening to things that, quite honestly, give me a headache sometimes. And if you need to be jostled back, I'll try to say things in a few different ways, right? So we're going to talk about enzymatic pathways. Yay! So the liver and other sites in our body have multiple enzymes that process and metabolize all kinds of things that we're ingesting. Food, alcohol, illicit drugs, prescribed medications, over-the-counter medications. everything we take in is being broken down by enzymes. And we call those systems of enzymes enzymatic pathways. When we have one or more things that are being metabolized within the same enzymatic pathway, we can impact how well those enzymes are going to work. So we can induce or inhibit. That's going to be in your bad dreams later tonight. Inducing or inhibiting that pathway. And that then interferes with the other substances being metabolized in that pathway, right? So think about being on a freeway and you're driving down the freeway and you're coasting along at a responsible 70 miles an hour. And all of a sudden, there's a couple of lanes merging in together. And because now we have all of these different people trying to get on the same freeway, it kind of slows everybody down for a little bit. It kind of messes up how well we're all working on the freeway alone. And then once we get past it, we're all coasting again at that very responsible 70 miles an hour. So it's the same kind of idea. Once we start to put more things into that pathway, into that system, we can see interference in there. Okay, we're going to the next slide. So one last look at that cute little pathway right there, and be prepared to glaze over a little bit more because we're going to talk about cytochrome P450, which is everybody's favorite thing. So cytochrome P450, or what we fondly refer to as CYP450, is a series of enzymes that can be found in most tissues of the body. And they play key roles in a lot of different things, right? Hormone and cholesterol synthesis, vitamin D synthesis, they're really involved. And then we have metabolism. So metabolism of a lot of the things we're bringing in, specifically medications, including our psychotropic medications, as well as some of our illicit substances. And grapefruit. So think about it. Sometimes you may have been on a medication or seen a commercial where it says you're not supposed to eat grapefruit with it. We're about to find out why. Okay. So in CYP450, there are 57 genes that code for enzymes, and they all have really exciting, easy to remember names like CYP2D6 and CYP3A4 and CYP2C9 and CYP2C19. That one always throws me off. And you can imagine how it goes on, right? Like, we're not getting too creative. And it's definitely not the most exciting thing in the world. But all of those CYPs are different enzymes that break down different substances we're putting into our body, right? So we talked a little bit about inducing and inhibiting and what that means. So if I'm going to be a substance that induces, so tobacco, for example, tobacco is a strong inducer at CYP1A2. So strong an inducer that there are several medications where we have to adjust dosing if somebody is a tobacco user, because it can have a very heavy impact on the bioavailability of what they're taking. So an inducer is going to speed up the enzyme activity. That means it increases the metabolism rate of the substances happening in that enzyme pathway and decreases the available amount of that substance for your body to take in and use. So tobacco is speeding up CYP1A2 so much that when you take Clozaril, you might be getting 100 milligrams of Clozaril that you're taking, but you might only be getting practically about 50 milligrams in your body, right? So an inducer can really impact how much is available for your body to use in a way that means that a medication might not be very effective because we're not at an effective dose anymore. You're taking that effective dose, but because it's being broken down so quickly, that's not the amount that's getting into your body. Inhibitors do the opposite. So inhibitors slow down the enzyme, increasing the amount that's available of that substance. So by slowing down the enzyme, we're slowing down how that metabolism is working. And now it's taken us so long to break it down that we have so much more than we intend, right? And that can lead to toxicity or even overdose or just risk of side effects. So grapefruit juice is a strong inhibitor of CYP3A4, and that can lead to an increased bioavailability of a medication that is also being broken down by CYP3A4. And in some instances, that can be pretty unsafe. We can be more at risk for side effects or toxicity. Okay, deep breath. Do we feel like we need another revisit of inducing and inhibiting, or did I lose everybody? This is real exciting stuff. Okay. All right, so get ready for even more fun. So when we talk about CYP450 and cannabinoids, and we're not going to talk specifically about individual medications tonight because I would be here all night just being like Lexapro, CYP2C9, and nobody's going to remember or even care about that, right? And the point is, you don't have to remember or care about that. When I need to have this conversation with someone, I'm pulling up tables in the background because I don't remember where all of these things are inhibiting and inducing. And as we're about to find out, it gets real messy. It gets real complicated. So I don't expect anybody to really be able to remember all of these details. The idea here is just to give an idea of what's happening so that you have a frame of reference and a context for other conversations that you might want to have. For the overachievers with photographic memories, or who are saving this later, like I do, to pull up when you're having a conversation with somebody, we have some of our main cannabinoids, THC, CBD, and CBN, which we haven't talked about yet tonight, but is functionally more similar to CBD and is getting some pretty interesting research itself right now. And then we have the primary CYP450 enzyme that breaks them down. That's a fun word, primary. That will give you more headaches. Or just me. I get a lot of headaches with this stuff. Primary because that's going to be the main thing breaking down THC or the main thing breaking down CBD. But that doesn't mean there aren't other enzymes involved. And that doesn't mean that there aren't active metabolites that then need to be broken down that might act in other enzymatic pathways as well, right? In other systems. So, but these are the prime ones. And you can see the main point of this here is, wow, that's a lot of them. For one, THC touches on a lot of those CYP450 enzymes. CBD touches on a lot of those CYP450 enzymes. CBN touches on 3A4, which is one of the main CYP450 enzymes that breaks down our psychotropic medications. So a lot of potential for impact here is the main point of that otherwise not very helpful chart. Another fun game is that the route of administration can also change how cannabinoids interact with CYP450. If I am inhaling, it is different than if I'm not inhaling, so I'm taking an edible, right? It's going to be metabolized by a different set of enzymes than it would be if I was inhaling, if I'm having an edible. Okay, so this is usually where I feel like most people's brains are by now. I'm sorry, what? So essentially, and this is kind of the big thing to keep in mind, right? There's a lot of factors at play here. Route of administration, how am I taking in the cannabis or the cannabinoids? What's the concentration? Are we high THC, high CBD? How much are we using? And how often are we using it? all of those things, including, and here's where it gets real fun, active metabolites and genetic differences in metabolism, which we're kind of understanding a little bit better now. It's not great, but we're getting there. But there's genetic differences. So my CYP450 system is going to work differently than Anna's CYP450 system. I might have already a very fast or a very slow CYP3A4. And so that's going to play a role as well. If I already have a very fast and then you're inducing it, I'm basically getting nothing from a medication that I would be taking in when we think I'm getting something, right? So all of those things are going to interact with prescribed psychotropics in different ways. With any kind of consistent use of marijuana, and that's really the key here, consistency. If I use once a month on a weekend with my buddies while we're fishing, I don't know why fishing was the example. That sounds horrible. But, if you like to fish, it's not. Then I'm probably not at really high risk for these kinds of interactions, right? But if I'm using a few times a week or every day or a few times a day, like a lot of the people that we serve might, then we're going to have a much higher risk for interactions between that cannabis and our prescribed psychotropics. So in essence, regular marijuana use does impact the amount of the psychotropic medication that's available for our bodies to use, which can have an impact on the safety, right? We're breaking it down really slow. We get too much of it, it can become a safety concern, or the efficacy of that prescription. If I'm breaking it down really fast and there's not very much of it getting into my body, we don't know why it's not working for me, and it might just be that there's not very much getting into my body. Okay. Big deep breaths. I promise we're done with that. So one of the last things that I really want to make sure that we touch on is, okay, so what do I do with that? You said don't memorize it. Don't try and sit there and be like, okay, you are inhaling THC, and I know that that's going to inhibit. Honestly, I need to go back a couple slides because I don't remember if it inhibits or induces anymore. At this enzyme, and your Prozac is being broken down over here, right? We don't need to be doing that. So the idea isn't to memorize or really try even to practically apply it for most people in this room. It's just a tool to enhance your understanding of what might be happening for somebody, right? So now that I know that these enzymes exist, now that I know that there are things that can induce and inhibit them, and that cannabis is one of those things, I now have a frame of reference for when somebody comes and says, yeah, I've been taking this Lexapro for how many weeks and it's not doing anything, and I don't think it's the right thing because it's not doing anything. Well, maybe your heavy cannabis use is impacting that because I know that there are all of these factors that can do that, right? So the idea is just to give you a little bit more understanding and a little bit more of a tool to facilitate that kind of discussion. You really want to then use that to just enable you to talk a little bit more about cannabis use with your, I think most of the people in here are working in some capacity with clients or individuals. But even if you're in here as a peer or as a parent, a concerned parent or a friend, right? You have an enhanced understanding that can allow you to have a different kind of conversation about your friends or your child's or your cousin's marijuana use and how that might be impacting them. One thing you always really want to make sure that you do is consider your bias and really work to be non-judgmental, right? Your bias might be Cannabis is the best. It definitely cures all of the things, and there are definitely no side effects. I don't know what this cannabis hyperemesis nonsense is she's talking about, but it's super not real, right? If your bias is that, and you see this happening, that's just a really important thing to keep in mind in that conversation of saying, okay, so, I think this is really great. I think this is probably going to help everything. Also, it might be impacting how well your medications are working. And so I want to make sure that I'm not pushing that opinion on someone while I'm having that conversation. And the same the other way around, right? We want to have these conversations. They're going to be the most effective. They're going to be the most helpful when we can sit down and say, tell me about what you're doing. Tell me about what you want, and let me help share what I know to provide some education, right? Going back to that conversation of let's see how you feel. Let's actually pay attention to how do you feel when you use. A lot of people who use marijuana, especially really heavily, have convinced themselves it's helpful, whether it is or not. And so sometimes just being someone who doesn't say, well, okay, I need you to stop using, and saying, all right, well, let's check it out. Let's see how it is, right? Um, can open that door to a conversation in a different kind of way. I recently had a patient who I've been seeing for quite a few years who has been a very, very heavy, probably 3 times a day, daily cannabis smoker. And unfortunately, she can't afford it right now. So she's been really cutting back and hasn't used at all in about 2.5 or 3 weeks. And it led to some really insightful and interesting discussions. And I had to really watch my nerd because I was super wanting to like experiment and see. And we talked about it's going to be interesting to see how you feel different with your medications now because you don't have something going in there and mucking around in your body's metabolism of those medications. And then there were a lot of other factors, right, that she was noticing, like she suddenly felt bored and realized she needed to find something entertaining to do that she enjoyed, right? And so having some of those conversations and being non-judgmental, you really open the door to be able to talk about some of that stuff and hopefully help somebody make a little bit more lasting change. If you're in a capacity where you can or you should, make sure that the person who's prescribing those psychotropic medications is aware of the individual's use so that any potential interactions can be explored. As a prescriber, I see my patients for somewhere between 20 and 30 minutes, once a month to once every 3 months. They might see their clinician or their peer every week or every 2 weeks for an hour. They're going to have a different kind of relationship with you. They're going to have more trust. They might share things that they don't feel comfortable sharing with me. They might be concerned that they won't be able to get their medication if they're honest with me about use. There can be a lot of reasons. They might not think it's important. That's my favorite one. When people definitely don't think it's important to share something with me because they just don't know that it might be important. So it might not even be intentional or a lack of comfort. So if you have awareness and you don't think that prescriber has awareness, it's a really important thing to share so that we can be aware of what's really happening. And there might be medications we might need to adjust or change, or at least discussions that we can have, providing some of that education about practically what's happening because both of those things are being used. And then, as always, be cautious not to provide medical advice or direction regarding medication use and cannabis interactions if it is not within your scope. Don't pull up the chart and say, all right, you're inhaling and you're inhaling THC and you're taking this medication, and I see that those are both being metabolized in 2C9, so you got to increase your medication intake, right? Please don't do that. That's generally not what we would want to do anyways, but just always remember to use the information that you have now responsibly and not provide advice outside of your scope. And questions? I don't think there were any that popped in there
I
in
did
that
not.
last.
I
I know
didn't
that
see any
last
in the
chunk can be a
chat.
little bit of a, please, dear God, don't make me ask questions about all of those letters and numbers.
Oh, there is a question.
Okay. I think, oh, thank you. I think that you mean like track how they're feeling. I usually just start with asking them to notice how they're feeling and talking about what other people have shared with me. So having it come from a place of some of the things I've heard from other patients when we have that discussion. I generally try not to make it something more formal than that because most of the time it won't happen. If there's an app or a process that I want them to follow. And I also don't want them to feel like this is a real, formal or structured thing. I really just want them to say, okay, so I know that I use because I feel like it helps me sleep or I feel like it helps with my anxiety. So just notice. Do you feel anxious after you smoke? Do you feel anxious after you use? What kind of feelings are you having? When we have something that we have relied on to help us feel good, it is a really strong mental effect to not attribute negative things to that item, right? And that can be a lot of different things. It can be a person in our lives. We don't want that cannabis to be the reason why I feel anxious after I smoke. Because this is what I'm holding on to is helping me feel better. So sometimes it's just kind of turning on the light and opening up our eyes and saying, okay, I do actually feel more anxious after I smoke. It doesn't mean that I'm ready to stop, but now we can have a different kind of conversation about what that's like. So there's a question about any specific psychotropic medications that should not be used with regular cannabis use. There are no direct unsafe contraindications. So there's nothing like, you really can't use this medication if they're smoking. Everybody practices a little bit differently. Everybody has different risk limits. There are a lot of prescribers who won't prescribe a controlled substance if somebody is using marijuana. There are a lot of prescribers who feel very uncomfortable prescribing antipsychotic medications to somebody who's using marijuana because of those pro-psychotic effects. So that is, that's kind of like where a lot of the lines get drawn. And that's really going to be prescriber dependent. And then, yes, Jennifer said, so generally after use, how are they feeling and what are they experiencing? Yeah, exactly. Just kind of asking them to be a little bit more mindful about it than to kind of go along with the normal thought process of, my mind just went completely blank. I apologize. The normal thought process of, oh, this is going to help me with my anxiety, right? Okay. All right. So signs to be aware of someone has consumed a high dose. So kind of just the typical thing, really disconnected, often high anxiety or panic attacks, rapid breathing, feeling disoriented or confused. That that high dose is going to be a little bit different for everybody. It's going to be different if you are a frequent user because you're going to have some tolerance that other people don't have, than if you don't use very much. I'm not sure if I'm answering that question totally. So if you feel like there's more to it, then let me know. And yes, so someone said bipolar diagnosis is a red flag, which yeah, a lot of my patients with bipolar are heavy marijuana uses, and they're often people who, when we have that users, and when we have that conversation, they're often some of those patients who come back and say, oh my gosh, I didn't even realize it, but I feel super agitated. Everybody I'm using with is really chill, but I am not. And I never really noticed that before, right? That message of this is good for you and nothing bad comes of it is really, really strong. In the ER, you can be on a third or fourth visit with cyclical vomiting and completely be unable to convince somebody that their marijuana use is playing a role in that. It is a very strong message. And there are a lot of people who can use marijuana sparingly or even with some consistency and not have those impacts. But there are a lot of people who can't. And just like anything else, there's going to be positives and negatives, and there's going to be people who can manage and people who can't manage. But it's interesting that the narrative, the societal narrative around it is so strong that no, there aren't people who can't. This is a good thing for everybody. And that can be a little bit hard to shift.
Great questions so far. Any other questions or comments at this time? All right, I
It
am
does not seem like
seeing.
it.
Oh,
I
oh,
think
go ahead, Leanne.
the schedule one classification is really is hard. The way that it's still scheduled and then the way that it's legalized and the disconnect between that. And I feel like that should, that's an interesting part of the discussion and not being able to do the research, what you were saying. And also
Mhm.
just continuing on with the bipolar part, depending whether it's bipolar 1 or 2, but the individuals that I've seen as well personally have witnessed that psychotic break in using and overdosing in marijuana and finally in some of the clients realizing they cannot, no matter how much they want to. And that's a really big part of what you were saying. What happens in session is the realization and the coming to terms that just because somebody else does that may be able to use marijuana in a safer way or it may reduce anxiety, so they think, or help with their depression. Bipolar is a very different kind of diagnosis when it comes to use with cannabis. Not that all of them can be affected, obviously, but I think it's scarier from what I've seen.
Mhm. Absolutely. And I do think because bipolar isn't always diagnosed right away, um, it's often a population who has been self-medicating in some way, shape, or form for a long time. And so it can be really hard to help people be open to the idea that what they've been using to survive so far might not be the most helpful thing. And that's really what they've been doing, is using something to help them survive. There was a question about any success convincing teens of medical information. Sometimes. I will say, I think it's dependent on the relationship and other factors. Later teens, more success than earlier teens, I feel like. And it often takes a lot more time and a lot more discussion about it. So going over this information a few times, having side effects from medication and being able to draw that connection, pulling up the happy little charts with the CYP450 enzymes and saying, look, you're doing this, and it's all in the same place, and you're having all these side effects, but only on the weeks that you're using. And let's, like, let's talk about that. I've had some. It is definitely harder, I think, because that population in general doesn't always want to be on medication, even if they can recognize that it helps them feel better, is trying to figure out who they are and how having their diagnosis fits into that, how treatment fits into that, how wanting to fit in with their friends who might be using fits into that. So even sometimes if it makes sense and they understand, it doesn't always fully make the connection.
I had a question back to, you had a slide about chemotherapy side effect treatment, for to combat nausea and whatnot. You said something in 2020 was approved. Was it some type of cannabinoid derivative in the medications? Is that
Yes, synthetic. It's primarily everything FDA approved in the US, I believe, is a synthetic cannabinoid. So it's going to be
okay?
structurally very similar to CBD or THC, but we're making it in a lab. And the medications that are approved for like nausea and chemotherapy are more THC based. THC has a higher impact on our appetite and that emetic reflex than CBD does.
I'm just curious how they came about that without research, yet they won't change the schedule, from one. Like, how did they come up with approving it for this medical care? And, I guess, I'm puzzled, I guess, because
So
you
you
have
have
to
to
have research.
also
So,
think about some of the things that it's approved for, right? So anorexia and HIV, nausea and vomiting and chemotherapy treatment, and two very specific forms of severe intractable pediatric epilepsy. So there is a big difference between, in the research world, intolerability depending on what it is we're researching. So if I am researching a vaccine, for example, or this discussion recently came up with someone and like the male birth control pill that was under research and was stopped in development because of the same side effects that the female birth control pill gives us. Excuse me, I forgot to introduce that I have cats. They were calm for everything until right now. There we go. So the difference and why research was stopped in that is because when we're doing research, if people are having significant side effects, we have to prove that there's a benefit to continue doing that research that outweighs those side effects, right? So in women, birth control is used for so many things other than just controlling birth. And so there is a reason to continue to see how that works. In men, not really, right? When we think about vaccines, if there are side effects that are intolerable, at some point they have to stop research because we are vaccine by nature. We're giving something to somebody who isn't sick. I'm not treating something. I'm giving you something. So our standards for safety and tolerance and efficacy are going to be different. And I think that's probably a little bit about how we got to where we are in terms of the medication treatment formulations, because we're looking at 3 conditions, technically 4, that are incredibly severe and don't have a lot of other good treatments. So I would guess probably it has something to do with that our ethical standards are adjusted based on what else is available and how severe is this thing that we're trying to research and study.
Okay, thank you.
It's a really good point. Also, sorry for like 8 examples. I love this stuff. I totally nerd out on it.
Very good. My brain's eating it all up. I'm sure everybody else's is. And for those who are aware, this is where if you feel this is something to advocate about, this is where advocacy comes into play, if especially from that research perspective on more information for our individuals served. It was in the Senate a few years ago, I believe, and then it dropped through. It's something that continuously comes up on the Senate floor. So maybe one day we'll see it move to Schedule 2. I think what many of us just want to see is Schedule 2, so we have true information to be able to provide to ourselves and our individuals served.
It
And my
is,
voice
I
is
think,
going so strong.
being looked at. It was being looked at very, very recently, like within the last couple of months, because I know they're also looking at descheduling a few other things that have been Schedule ones. So I would assume that it has the potential to be coming up again very soon.
Something to be on the lookout for. I'm sure that will make headlines when it does. Hopefully. We have a few more minutes left. If there's any other questions or comments, it's been great questions, great conversation, great information, and so happy to have so many of you here tonight. It's been a great turnout. All right now I see none, so we'll kind of move forward. If anything else has come up, we're still paying attention to the chat, or you can take yourself off mute. I'm just trying to save my voice a little bit. So with that being said, we're going to thank Emily for all the great information that was today. The PowerPoint was sent to you in PDF form with the link, so you have this information to save for yourself if you want to reference back to any of this information. In the next moment or so, Kaylee is going to put the link for the evaluation in the chat for you.